Hi, everyone. This is Phil Travis, and this week's lesson is on really the beginning of the Cold War, particularly in the period of 1946 to 1947, where a number of really critical issues come to the fore that really, create the Cold War. And these are associated with atomic weapons, with political situation in Europe, with the situation of Germany, and also, and maybe most significantly, the situations in Iran, Greece, and Turkey, which in this region of the world become really at the core of major decisions by both the United States and the Soviet Union to begin policies that ultimately amount to the beginning of an arms race and also the Cold War. So something I want to I'll go ahead and put these up. Something I wanted to remind everyone from our discussion last week or from our lecture last week is the importance of leadership in decisions that were made at the outset of the Cold War. Now, when we say this, I'm not trying to say that if there had been a different leader, it necessarily would have been different. We can't know that, of course. But what we can know is that the decisions made by the leaders who were in charge at the time were very significant to the outset of the Cold War. And these decisions by folks like Truman and Stalin were to a large degree influenced by World War II, or particularly the period before the outset of hostilities of World War II. The so-called Lessons of Munich, the Munich Conference, of course, in 1938, when the Allies appeased Hitler and gave to him the Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia. This became, the symbol of appeasement. And after this, both the United States as well as Stalin, of course also Britain, are deeply influenced by what this lesson meant for future foreign relations. For the United States, you don't appease aggressor. You don't appease a dictator that potentially could be more offensive. And that lesson has applied to the thinking of some foreign policy specialists well into the future, including applications with respect to Saddam Hussein's Iraq, as well as even with respect to the issues in the Crimea and the Ukraine more recently. And of course, the question with this interpretation, by the way, is when is this actually an applicable way of looking at a historical situation? So anytime that one applies the lessons of Munich becoming very aggressive against a power that might be perceived as an offensive power, when is the comparison to the rise of Nazi Germany and the Blitzkrieg of Europe? When is it applicable? When is it not? Likewise, the Stalin's viewpoint, World War II was only further confirmation in his view that the capitalist West sought to destroy the Soviet Union. Stalin associated Hitler's Germany, while it was fascist, he associated it more broadly with anti-communist intentions of the West. And so the Soviet Union under Stalin very much sought to construct a buffer zone to protect the Soviet communist world from what it saw as the designs of the West. And likewise, the Allies, particularly the United States and Great Britain, became very proactive in their prevention of Soviet advances in any areas of the world. The Cold War is, in some respects, maybe in terms of rhetoric, should be tracked to the beginning of 1946 with the dual declarations of the Cold War. First, February 9th, Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union declares that Marxist-Leninist ideals are valid for the unevenness of development of the capitalist countries. And the West understood this a little bit differently. To the West, that statement was like a declaration of war. It was like saying that the Soviet Union must expand. It's not clear that that's exactly what Stalin meant, but that's how it was received in the West. And likewise, on March 5th, of course, while in Missouri, Winston Churchill, of course, gave his famous Iron Curtain speech, stating that an Iron Curtain has descended and that God has willed the atomic bomb for the United States. So these were important rhetorical points for the emergence of the Cold War, but I think the first two most important actual events occurred in Iran and Turkey. So Iran was a key issue during World War II. Iran had been, effectively a part of the British Empire, and the British oil interests were highly invested in Iran. And during Iran, there was different. During World War II, there were different, kind of ideas for dealing with Iran. Some suggested dividing Iran. By 1944, there was a decision made amongst the Allies that Iran would be free, but the Soviets and British would share the oil. And this was kind of the issue. Is the interest in Iran, of course, was respect to, the resources there, and the Soviet Union very much wanted a piece of this. In early 1946, the United States and the British reneged on that agreement, the agreement to allow the Soviets access to Iranian oil. And this becomes a bit of a trend in the early Cold War as the Allies are increasingly suspicious, increasingly concerned about a possible expansive threat from the Soviet Union. As a result of changing course in 1946, the Soviets inspired a revolt in Azerbaijan, which is today a small independent country just to the north of Iran. And the Soviets inspired a revolt in Azerbaijan, and they positioned their military there. And this created tremendous concern for the Allies and the United States, leading our Secretary of State, James Burns, at the time, to claim that the Soviet Union was on the move everywhere. There was a lot of concerns that there could be an actual engagement between the forces of the Soviet Union and those of the West in Iran. Ultimately, the Iranian leaders made a deal with the Soviets about oil access, but the United States kind of double-crossed Stalin in this case. And once the Soviet military was out of Azerbaijan, effectively the Iranian government backed out on the agreement, and increasingly the United States tried to encourage Iran leaning towards the Western sphere of influence. And of course, this will come to fruition perhaps most during the Eisenhower administration, when the socialist-leaning leader Mossadegh was overthrown in a coup supported by the CIA and the British special agents MI6, and therein installing the Shah of Iran. The Shah became a Western leading kind of hardline leader. And it was in the context of that leader that the sort of more radical, more Islamist leadership that you have in Iran today emerged. It's a very important long-term historical lesson about this period of the origin of the Cold War. Turkey, there was an issue with the British allowing access to the Dardanelles, basically the areas through the Bosphorus Straits where the Black Sea enters into the Mediterranean. The Soviet Union very much was interested in having open access to this because the Soviet Union lacked a warm water port, and the Black Sea was almost that. But the issue, of course, was a concern over expansion of Soviet influence within the Mediterranean. These events, the events in Azerbaijan, revolts in Greece, issues in Turkey, and what's seen as a Soviet intent to spread their influence lead to the emergence of something called the domino theory. And the domino theory, as I'll go ahead and show you the kind of 1980 Cold War map again to give you a feeling for what we're talking about. The domino theory is really the formal idea that the United States will use to justify military, monetary, various forms of commitment throughout the developing world during the Cold War, and Europe, actually, not just the developing world. In fact, the domino theory really was first most applicable to a concern in Europe. And the idea behind the domino theory was that that the United States had to contribute internationally in a way that it had not before. The United States had to be militarily involved in a way that it had not before, because if we didn't stop communism in a particular place, like Vietnam by the late 1950s, like Greece or Turkey, or even Iran, but particularly Greece and Turkey in 1946, that if we didn't do that, that communism would spread at an accelerated pace, and the United States would be increasingly unable to prevent a large-scale expansion of communism. Of course, ultimately, one of the big questions we ask is, does the USSR really represent the same threat as Hitler in 1938? Were the lessons of Munich really applicable here? And most scholars and some specialists at the time, like George Kennan, for example, the founder of the containment policy, were really not convinced that the Soviet Union represented the same threat as Hitler. Stalin was opportunistic, exploiting weak points where they existed. And so American strategists like George Kennan will devise a strategy to contain the Soviet Union by drawing a resistance in certain areas that the Soviet Union wishes to expand in and contain them. And the idea was that you could contain them, they wouldn't seek all-out total war, and you could contain them and then ultimately negotiate with them. That was the original idea behind the containment policy, though it changes in not too long, and George Kennan will resign because of it. You also have to remember, before I flip the slide here, the Soviet Union is utterly decimated. The Soviet Union lost upwards of 20 to 25 million people in World War II. Their country is very much ravaged. So the idea that they even possess that kind of capability is in itself, quite dubious. Another major issue, of course, was the issue of atomic weaponry. And, of course, the United States possessed a nuclear monopoly in the immediate post-war period. In March 1946, Dean Acheson, the Acheson-Lilienthal Plan, proposed a plan to move these weapons into control by the United Nations. The Truman administration appointed Bernard Baruch to the UN to head the Atomic Energy Commission. And again, I say, leadership matters, because Baruch was really, kind of a hardliner with respect to the United States position on this. And, of course, the Truman administration will support this position. But Baruch wanted an all-or-nothing agreement, and he wanted the United States to be able to dictate the grounds. And it was a position that ultimately was unacceptable to the Soviets. Now, the Soviets refused to accept inspections into the Soviet Union. That was what ultimately was the number one factor for them. And the Soviets, of course, claimed that they wanted the immediate destruction of the weapons and an international agreement against their development and use. The Soviets suggested that they wanted these turned over into an international agency. However, we have to remember that very little is really known or understood about Stalin in the West at this time. We still have limited understanding of Stalin. And so there was a lot of suspicion about what Stalin's intentions were. And I think in a lot of cases one would have to say that those intentions were not entirely unfounded. And there was already distrust between the United States and the Soviet Union during not just because of the ideological reasons of communism, but of course during World War II, the United States openly shared information about its nuclear program with the British and withheld it from the Soviets. And Stalin, of course, found out through his espionage channels. But it's very difficult for the United States to give up this weapon, because there was a fear in the Truman administration that if you did this, you gave up the technological advantage in warfare, the greatest technological advantage ever, that the Soviets could turn around and develop their own, and then you would be at a disadvantage. And so the Truman administration was really pressured to not allow that to happen to them. And so the United States will hold on to the atomic monopoly. And this is very significant, of course, because this leads ultimately to a nuclear arms race. Because the Soviet Union will increasingly seek to construct its own weapons of this kind, which it will do, influenced to a significant degree by espionage. And these events very much enhance the Cold War. Even though atomic weapons was not were not always perceived by all of the people who asked to hold on to them, who thought we should hold on to them, they were not always perceived as an all or nothing thing. George Kennan, for example, believed that the United States should have a small arsenal of small atomic bombs that could be used, that were enough to provide a deterrent for containment of communism, and if used, could be used in relatively small scale, almost tactical ways. Whereas the position the United States took and the Soviet Union took was really to advance the mass production of bigger and bigger and more advanced atomic and then thermonuclear weapons, which creates a situation where effectively at the height of the Cold War, there was a risk that the United States and the Soviet Union could completely annihilate humanity from the earth. Today, of course, nuclear proliferation remains a huge issue. There's great concerns over an Iranian nuclear program. Israel possesses nuclear weapons, but it's undeclared. But it's widely accepted as fact that the Israelis tested a nuclear weapon in the late 70s down in the South Atlantic. Of course, Pakistan, India, North Korea, as well as the United States, Britain, the Soviet Union, China, possess these weapons. And these weapons in the world today remains one of the most concerning issues in foreign policy. And was it inevitable? Individuals like George Kennan tried to take actions to prevent it. And most historians suggest that history is not an inevitability. But there were very difficult decisions made at the time. Another very difficult situation that, again, and I kind of mentioned this in the previous lecture, but that, again, just is a very difficult situation, was the situation of Germany, because originally there was a real push for Germany to be reunited as one country, but there were such disagreements on what the future course for Germany should be that the Western powers left their troops largely in Germany, established bases in Germany, and the Soviet Union remained in Eastern Germany. And of course, Berlin became an island within Eastern Germany that was itself divided between West and East. And of course, in the beginning of John F. Kennedy's administration, Nikita Khrushchev will, of course, begin the construction of the Berlin Wall. Ultimately, the United States didn't feel it could get out of West Germany unless the Soviet Union got out of West Germany and ultimately changed its tune with respect to its vision for Germany. The United States insisted we wanted a unified, democratic, and a Western-friendly Germany. And likewise, the Soviet Union wanted a Germany that was like a satellite state that would be used to provide reparations and rebuild the Soviet Union. In 1946 and 47, what's the situation like in Europe? Well, it's bleak, right? The continent is, Western Europe is in ruins, and the United States is particularly concerned about this. To give you an idea, in the United Kingdom, they remained on certain rations well into the 50s. Many car companies in the late 40s ultimately, for their survival, were reliant on imported United States steel, which really enhanced the United States' position as a world producer, as a trade power. So Europe was in a very, very bad situation. Cities were destroyed, economies were ruined, loss of life in Germany, in France, in Great Britain was tremendous. What is the United States particularly worried about here? In the late 1940s, they're worried about communist movements, political movements in France and in Italy. Now, ultimately, the containment policy will change over time and it will lead to conflicts like the Vietnam War. But initially, the United States was primarily worried about communism in Europe. They were worried about France and Italy being overrun in elections by communists who were legitimate members of the political apparatus in Italy and France. They're worried about anti-government resistance in Western-friendly countries like Greece and Turkey. Greece was not a democracy. It was arguably a repressive monarchy. But you have anti-government, leftist-affiliated resistance in the Mediterranean region, in very important areas, the Bosphorus Straits area. And so these were of great concern. This is kind of where the domino theory again kind of emerges. So what will the United States do? What would you do in this situation? What the United States actually will do is really the most significant, probably, formal actions leading to the Cold War. And these are, of course, with respect to the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. Here you see, in the next slide, we'll talk about the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. But here you see a map of Europe that demonstrates the distribution of the aid funding program from the Marshall Plan that goes to Western European countries. What the United States did was to ask Congress first, with the Truman Doctrine, to provide international monetary support for the Greek government in fighting against communist insurgents. And ultimately, we would provide aid to Turkey as well. The Greek government was a non-communist government. It declared opposition to communism and to Soviet totalitarianism. And the United States had to sell this. This is at a time where there were still a lot of fiscal conservatives in Congress. And the United States had never been a country that had a large peacetime military. The United States had never been a country that was the leader in foreign aid investment in the world. The United States had never been a country that had these kind of huge standing national security complex ever before. And if you wanted to have that, if you wanted to become a world power, which is really what this decision is about, then you have to do those things. You have to invest in a myriad of ways in the international world. You need to be the leader in investment. You need to be on the cutting edge of military technology and military preparedness at all times. And that costs money. And there were a lot of people in Congress who were fiscal conservatives who did not, in their heart, probably want to spend that money. But the Truman administration really believed in the stakes here and believed in what was at stake in terms of American interests and American positioning in the world. And so the Truman administration and Secretary of State Dean Acheson went into the Truman Doctrine speech with one principle, and that was to scare the hell out of them. And that's a direct quote. They wanted to scare the hell out of them so that they would be convinced that they needed to support the kinds of economic and military support programs that the administration felt were necessary to defend the world against Soviet-inspired communism. And this, of course, is where you see the first emergence of the domino theory, which is the assertion that we've got to fight in Turkey. We've got to support insurgents in Greece, or the government in Greece. To prevent insurgents from overrunning Greece. Because if Greece falls, then before you know it, all of Western Europe's going to fall, and we're going to lose out on a huge, important area of influence, and freedom will suffer a blow. And the tactic really works, and Congress approves an unprecedented aid program. First, in March 1947, $40 million for the Greek government. And then later, proposed through George Marshall, the so-called Marshall Plan, which was a $16 billion plan to rebuild the economies of Europe. And the money was offered to the Soviet Union, but it wasn't something that the Soviet Union felt it could accept. Because if the Soviet Union accepted it, it would also ultimately come with prerequisites for other issues with respect to Eastern Europe or other things. It would have been dictated by the United States. It would have given the United States a upper hand. And so this is a really, really significant development because it really is the first time where the United States will take an action that really formally demonstrates the divide, a divide developing between East and West. And of course, eventually they'll form NATO, and of course, the Soviet Union will form the Warsaw Pact, and they will create this kind of polarized world of the Cold War will emerge, really particularly in the context of the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan works. It strengthens Western Europe. The idea was to prevent the domino theory. We can't really say that that worked because it was just a theory and it's never actually been proven to be accurate. But the Marshall Plan was very successful in helping to rebuild Europe. It was also very successful in establishing the United States as the predominant world power, for the future, of the Cold War. The United States emerges as the most influential power, really in the world. Only rivaled, of course, by the Soviet Union. And really, the United States had made a decision to become a global power that would provide important aid to allies and would base its strength and its sphere of influence on this, and that would commit to having the most high-tech, advanced, and capable military in the world. We committed to this, and this was in the context of the emergence of the Cold War, and it's something that has shaped the United States as an international power. It's also shaped the United States domestically ever since. So I'm going to put these up here. I just want to run through these ones real quick. I just wanted to just kind of reiterate some of those points. The significance of the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan was expanded U.S. involvement internationally. These huge aid programs keep Europe in the American sphere of influence, Western Europe at least. It also marks kind of the end of true fiscal conservatism as a real legitimate political position because once you create this massive national security state, this huge military-industrial complex, it becomes very, very difficult for a fiscal conservative to resist the large kind of funding appropriations that are required by a global superpower that requires the maintenance of a large standing army as well as bases all over the world. And so it becomes the type of strong fiscal conservatism that existed before World War II is now less tenable. It's just it's just the necessity of the expansion of the national security state, really. Not to say there aren't true fiscal conservatives that exist. I'm just saying that their voice, they're not going to be a true majority, as even individuals that promoted themselves as fiscally conservative, like people associated with the Ronald Reagan administration in the 1980s, still accepted large deficits, and they still accepted expanded appropriations to the national security state and the military-industrial complex. Of course, the fear of communism as a justification for war, potentially. The origins of the Cold War national security paradigm, global bipolarity, really characterized most in the United States' sense as an opposition to totalitarian communism. The United States had intervened in a civil war, a foreign civil war, in Europe no less. Which was something that would have been commonplace in Latin America, but it was a pretty new thing for the United States to intervene in a civil war in the Mediterranean. And also the expansion of the power of the president in international relations. The Cold War ultimately creates a wide growth in executive power when it comes to making war and foreign policy. And of course, the Vietnam War becomes the most infamous undeclared war in American history, a war that Congress agreed to, but agreed to in an open-ended fashion. And so it was a war that was really completely dictated, organized, and directed by the executive branch, as were the wars in Iraq, both the first Persian Gulf War, as were of course, the Operation Iraqi Freedom, as well as the Operation Afghanistan. In fact, since World War II, the United States has never actually had Congress declare a war. Instead, we've turned to these loose resolutions that give the executive branch even greater ability to make war as they see fit in the interest of national security. George Kennan, as I mentioned earlier, is the father of the containment policy, and he was known as Mr. X because he wrote a document relating to the Soviet military power. He was stationed in the USSR. He was a specialist on Soviet foreign policy, and he wrote this. He wrote this secret, if you will, memorandum in 1947 that outlined the containment policy, the containment doctrine. The containment policy, it changes. Initially, George Kennan influenced containment policy is really only the dominant sort of force in the Truman administration during the late 40s. And even then, the Truman administration is going against certain aspects of George Kennan's ideas of containment. For example, George Kennan did not like the purposeful, exaggerated fear tactics that were used in the Truman Doctrine speech. He thought that the United States intentionally created a heightened concern over Soviet communism, and that in doing so sort of helped to facilitate a policy that was increasing the likelihood that there would be a permanent bipolarity, a Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States. George Kennan, what he believed in was that you contained communism in certain strong points. You would use a counterforce to prevent Soviet military gains in certain critical areas, strong points. It was an asymmetrical type of approach. So he doesn't think you have to contain communism everywhere all the time, but he thinks, in Iran it's probably a good idea. In Greece it's probably a good idea. And his idea was that the Soviet Union wasn't like Hitler, that the Soviet Union was relatively weak, and they were going to seek to exert force and expand influence in certain specific critical strong points, places that have oil, for example, places that have access to, a warm water port. And so he felt you just had to contain the Soviet Union, and eventually you would contain them long enough where they would simply cease the saber rattling, and they would be ready to discuss, to have normal conversations and diplomacy, and to enter the Western world, sort of with the rest of the world. That was his idea. He didn't believe that we should promote containment for the sake of the overthrow of the Soviet Union. Though that wasn't necessarily something that he was necessarily, opposed to. Like he certainly would have preferred a democratic Soviet Union, I think, or Russia, I think. But his policy was not a policy to promote the collapse of the Soviet Union. Ultimately, that's how containment policy will develop. It will become a global policy that is based on the idea of proxy wars, sometimes indirect wars, military buildup, military preparedness, ultimately until one or the other collapses. And that was kind of the course that the Soviet Union, or the containment policy took, though it was not necessarily the way that containment policy inherently had to be. We'll talk a little bit more about that next week as I talk about the 50s and also the Cold War associated with the 50s. For George Kennan, Europe was the central factor, and the end game was really creating an environment for negotiations and normalization with the Soviet Union. Now, I want to briefly mention Southeast Asia. So, of course, the United States, I just want to touch on this because, I'll go ahead and put this up here for you. I just want to touch on this because, of course, in this class, we'll talk significantly about the Vietnam War. And the sort of long-term roots of the Vietnam War are actually established in the immediate aftermath of World War II. During World War II, the United States was an ally of Ho Chi Minh, who you see pictured down here below. Ho Chi Minh was a Vietnamese communist, but members of the State Department that met him believed he was a nationalist first and a communist second, meaning that what his goal was to gain independence for Vietnam from French imperialism, and during World War II against Japanese imperialism. And he happened to feel that communism was the preferred course for his country. Eventually, of course, the United States will fight a war in which 550,000 Americans ultimately are stationed there. Well over 1 million served in Vietnam at one time or another. 60,000 Americans died there. The United States dropped more bombs in Vietnam than all theaters of World War II combined between 1965 and 1973. And of course, the devastation to the Vietnamese people is incomprehensible. Well over 1 million people would have died, and ultimately that conflict. For the Vietnamese, their Vietnam War began in 1946 with the emergence of the French Indochina War. Ho Chi Minh, who was an ally of the United States, declared independence for Vietnam at the end of World War II. In his Declaration of Independence, he directly quoted the Declaration of Independence of the United States. He had the band play the Star-Spangled Banner. And an OSS plane, OSS was like a precursor to the US CIA. These were the guys that worked with Ho Chi Minh. They helped train the first 250 sort of gung-ho Viet Minh guerrillas. The next generation will be called the Viet Cong. An OSS plane did an overflight to cheering crowds. Ho Chi Minh was sending letters to President Truman, and they were all ignored. The Truman administration didn't really have a policy on Vietnam. And when the French Indochina War breaks out, which was largely a war that was because of the fact that Ho Chi Minh was declaring independence and the French wished to recolonize Indochina at the end of World War II. And the United States in the late 40s was far more supportive of the French. We wanted a strong Europe, and if that meant a reconstitution of aspects of the French Empire, we didn't want it, but we would accept it in the interest of containing communism in Western Europe. By the 1950s, that all changed, by the way. France, by the beginning of the 1950s, became increasingly disgruntled over Vietnam. The United States started funding that war. By 1954, when the climactic Battle of Dien Bien Phu was fought in the northwestern quarter of northern Vietnam, the United States was funding upwards of 90% of that war, as the war had become a war of global containment. Between the period of 1946 and 1954, particularly around 1949 with the fall of China to communism, and then of course the Korean War, the United States fundamentally shifted the containment policy. We saw a greater threat globally in the developing world. We saw a greater threat in Asia. And so the United States containment policy extended beyond Europe and instead extended to the entirety of the developing world. It became accepted that any advance of communism in any part of the developing world would be regarded as a absolutely critical national security threat for the United States. And the domino theory was just as applicable there. Ultimately, of course, the domino theory perhaps is most applicable to the war in Vietnam, which the containment policy was extended to following the so-called globalization of containment. That really begins in 1949 and 1950, and is associated really with the advent of global proxy wars, an arms race on another level with nuclear weapons, and increasing hostilities across the developing world. Okay, guys, I hope this is helpful. It's a little bit long. I'm sorry. I guess I have a lot to say about the Cold War. All right, but let's have a great week.